Concrete scraped Elena's cheek, smelling of stale rain and diesel. Trent's boot pressed into her back. He was laughing, not a cinematic, villainous laugh, just a wet, breathless chuckle that meant he was bored of hitting her. She didn't pray for a night. Nights didn't exist in this part of Chicago. She just prayed for the ringing in her ears to stop. Then, heavy silence dropped over the alleyway. A man stepped from the fog. "Get off my wife." Grease clung to the cuticles of Eleanor's fingers. She had scrubbed them 3 times with harsh industrial soap in the diner's cracked ceramic sink, but the scent of old fryer oil was practically tattooed into her skin. Her lower back throbbed, a dull, rhythmic ache that kept time with the blinking neon sign above the back door. 11 hours on her feet, carrying trays of meatloaf and lukewarm coffee, all for $42 in tips, and a manager who docked her pay because a customer complained her thighs brushed his shoulder when she served him. Elena pushed the heavy metal door open, stepping out into the alley. The cold November rain hit her face instantly, a shocking slap of freezing water that made her gasp. She pulled the thin collar of her polyester jacket tight around her neck. It didn't help. She was a big woman, soft in the places society demanded sharp angles, heavy where the world wanted empty space. Her uniform skirt dug mercilessly into her waist, the cheap fabric damp and clinging to her stomach. She just wanted her bed. A mattress that sank in the middle and a radiator that clanked like a dying engine. "Thought you might sneak out the front, piglet." Elena froze. The voice was slurred, thick with cheap beer and malice. Trent detached himself from the shadows by the overflowing dumpster. He was shivering, his thin windbreaker soaked through, but his eyes were bright with a frantic, ugly energy. He smelled like damp cigarettes and sour sweat. "Trent, I don't have anything," Elena said, her voice tighter than she wanted it to be. She kept her eyes on the mouth of the alley. 10 yards to the street. 10 yards to the streetlights. "Don't lie to me." He stepped into her path, blocking the narrow gap between the brick wall and the rusted dumpster. "You just finished a double. Hand over the tips. I need 200. Tonight. I made $40, and it's going to my electric bill so I don't freeze to death." She tried to push past him, a mistake she realized the second she moved. Trent grabbed her upper arm. His fingers dug painfully into the soft flesh. He yanked her back with a sudden, violent jerk that sent her stumbling. Her rubber-soled work shoes slipped on a patch of wet garbage, and she went down hard. Her palm slapped the asphalt, tearing the skin at the base of her thumbs. The shock of the impact rattled her teeth. Pain flared in her knees, ripping right through her thick black tights. "You stupid bitch," Trent hissed, towering over her. He kicked her side, not a full-force blow, but enough to knock the wind out of her lungs. "I owe men who don't ask twice. You think I care about your electric bill?" Elena curled inward, her breath hitching. The wet gravel bit into her cheek. The puddle beneath her smelled of rotting lettuce and motor oil. She tasted copper on her tongue. "Help," she croaked. Her voice sounded pathetic, small. She hated it. She hated him, but mostly she hated herself for being on the ground again. "Help!" she screamed, louder this time, her voice cracking over the sound of the downpour. Trent laughed. It was a wet, breathless sound. He squatted down, grabbing a handful of her wet hair, yanking her head back. "Who are you yelling for? Look around. Look at yourself. You're a fat, pathetic cow. Nobody is coming to save you. Who the hell would ever want you? You're going to empty your pockets, or I'm going to break your jaw and take it anyway." Elena's chest heaved, the rainwater mixed with the blood trickling from her lip. She closed her eyes. The humiliation burned hotter than the scrapes on her hands. He was right. That was the most agonizing part of it. The world didn't stop for women who looked like her. Let her go. The voice didn't boom. It didn't echo. It simply cut through the noise of the rain like a scalpel through tissue. Low, quiet, and perfectly calm. Trent froze, his grip on Elena's hair loosening. Elena cracked her eyes open. The street lamp at the end of the alley backlit the silhouette of a man. He didn't look like a cop. Cops walked heavy. This man walked like he owned the concrete he stepped on. As he stepped closer, the harsh yellow light caught the details. A long, dark wool overcoat that repelled the rain. Leather gloves, black and smooth. A face carved from exhaustion and cold pragmatism. His jaw was sharp, covered in a shadow of stubble, and his eyes were completely dead. They were the color of tarnished dimes, scanning the alley with absolute disinterest. Two massive men in dark suits materialized behind him, silent as ghosts. Trent dropped Elena's hair and scrambled backward, his boots slipping on the wet pavement. All the bravado vanished, replaced by a raw, animal terror. "Mr. Hayes, Arthur, please, I have the money. I was just getting it." Arthur Hayes didn't look at Trent. He looked down at Elena. Elena stared back up at him. She was a mess of torn pantyhose, muddy thighs, and bleeding knuckles. She expected disgust. She expected him to look away, the way men usually did when they caught her looking back. But Arthur's gaze didn't waver. He studied her chest heaving, the defiance warring with the terror in her wide eyes. "You owe me $60,000, Trent," Arthur said, his voice a low hum over the rain. He finally turned his attention to the pathetic man trembling by the garbage. "You're in a puddle, shaking down a waitress for pocket change. It's insulting. It offends me." "I was going to give her to the Russian," Trent babbled, pointing a shaking finger at Elena. "I swear, she's a pig, but they like them heavy at the docks. They'd pay. She's payment, Arthur. Take her." A heavy, suffocating silence dropped over the alley. Elena felt her stomach twist into a cold knot. The urge to vomit rose in the back of her throat. She pushed herself up onto her elbows, her muscles screaming, ready to try and crawl away. Arthur slowly reached into his overcoat. He pulled out a silver lighter and a cigarette. The click of the lighter was deafening. He took a slow drag, the cherry burning bright in the gloom. "You're offering me a woman who just begged for help," Arthur said. "You think I traffic in collateral?" "She's nobody," Trent cried, backing up until his shoulders hit the brick wall. "She's nothing. Nobody wants her." Arthur exhaled a plume of grey smoke. He stepped forward. He didn't rush. He moved with deliberate, terrifying grace. When he reached Trent, he didn't raise his voice. He just nodded to the man on his left. The larger man stepped up, grabbed Trent by the throat, and slammed his head against the brick. A sickening crunch echoed through the alley. Trent slumped, unconscious before he hit the ground. Arthur didn't even blink. He looked back down at Elena. Elena pushed herself into a sitting position, her heavy thighs trembling, her wet skirt plastered to her legs. She wasn't going to cower. If he was going to take her to the docks, he was going to have to drag her kicking and screaming. She'd lifted her chin, wiping the blood and rainwater from her mouth with a shaking, filthy hand. Arthur dropped his cigarette onto the wet asphalt and crushed it beneath the toe of his leather shoe. He reached down, offering her a gloved hand. "He's wrong," Arthur said, his voice flat, devoid of any theatrical romance. "I want you. I'll be your husband." The interior of the car smelled like expensive leather, dry cedar, and the faint metallic tang of gun oil. It was entirely too warm. Elena sat rigidly in the back seat of the Maybach, her arms wrapped tightly around her waist. She was terrified to lean back. Her uniform was soaked with dirty rainwater and dumpster sludge. She could see the muddy imprint of her shoes on the plush, cream-colored floor mats. She was ruining an interior that probably cost more than her life insurance policy. She felt massive. The luxury of the car seemed to shrink around her, amplifying every ounce of her weight. When she shifted, the leather squeaked under her thick thighs, a sound that made her cheeks burn with hot, ugly shame. Arthur sat beside her, though he kept a careful, deliberate distance. He hadn't spoken since he pulled her from the alley. His men had dumped Trent's unconscious body into the trunk of a trailing sedan before seamlessly sliding into the front seats of the Maybach. The privacy partition was rolled up. It was just the two of them in the back, encased in a silent, gliding fortress. Arthur reached forward, opening a small mahogany compartment. He pulled out a square crystal glass and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid from a decanter. He didn't offer her any. He just held it, staring out the tinted window at the blurred city lights. Elena's teeth began to chatter. The adrenaline was draining out of her bloodstream, leaving behind a bone-deep cold and an aching exhaustion. Her split lip stung. "I'm going to ruin your seats," she blurted out. The silence had become unbearable. Her voice was scratchy, raw from screaming. Arthur turned his head slowly. His eyes, those tarnished dimes, scanned her face. He didn't look at the muddy seats. "Leather wipes clean? Where are you taking me?" she asked, her hands balling into fists on her lap. She wasn't going to cry. She had promised herself, long ago, she wouldn't cry in front of men who hurt people. "If you're taking me to the docks, just kill me now. I won't go. I'll fight you. I'm heavier than I look. I'll make a mess in your nice car." Arthur took a sip of his drink. The corner of his mouth twitched. It wasn't a smile, just a microscopic break in his stone facade. "You're exactly as heavy as you look, and I have no business at the docks. I don't sell women." "Then why am I here?" she snapped, the anger finally bleeding through the terror. "People like you don't save people like me for free." Arthur set the glass down in a cup holder. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a clean, folded white handkerchief. He held it out to her. Elena stared at it. She snatched it from his hand and pressed it to her bleeding lip. It smelled faintly of laundry starch and expensive cologne. "I have a problem," Arthur said quietly, leaning his elbow against the armrest. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation has spent the last 3 years building a RICO case against my family. They believe they have me cornered. They expect me to do what men in my position historically do when cornered. They expect me to consolidate power. Marry the daughter of the Moretti family, merge our territories, and prepare for a war." Elena frowned, the handkerchief pausing against her mouth. "What does that have to do with me?" "They are watching everyone who fits the profile of a mob bride," Arthur continued, his tone conversational, as if he were discussing stock prices. "Socialites, daughters of associates, models. They have wires in the restaurants I eat at. They have tails on my cars. If I marry who they expect me to marry, they will use it to fast-track an indictment under the guise of an imminent gang war." He turned his full attention to her. His gaze wasn't unkind, but it was ruthlessly analytical. It stripped her down to her bare utility. "You," Arthur said, "are a waitress from the South Side. You have $60 in your bank account. You have no criminal record, no ties to any syndicate, and no social footprint. You are entirely, perfectly unremarkable." The word stung. Unremarkable. It was true, but hearing it, spoken with such sterile precision, felt like another kick to the ribs. "You want to marry me to confuse the FBI?" Elena asked, the absurdity of the situation making her dizzy. "I want to marry you to break their narrative," Arthur corrected. "A ruthless cartel boss doesn't spontaneously marry a diner waitress who struggles to pay her heating bill. It suggests instability, or better yet, it suggests I am stepping away from the life. It buys me time. Time I desperately need to locate the rat in my organization before the indictments come down. And what do I get? She asked. The cynicism was entirely reflexive. She was a girl who had to count pennies at the grocery store. She didn't believe in lottery tickets. You get to live, Arthur said flatly. Trent is a desperate man. The debt he owes me is substantial. If I had left you in that alley, he would have dragged you to someone worse. You wouldn't have survived the weekend. Elena's stomach plummeted. The truth of it tasted like ash in her mouth. Trent had crossed a line tonight. There was no going back to avoiding his calls. He had tried to sell her. Besides, Arthur added, his eyes dropping briefly to her bruised hands, clutching the damp handkerchief. You need a dentist. You need a safe place to sleep. You need money. I have an excess of all three. I'm not a prostitute, she whispered, her voice trembling. I don't want a prostitute, Arthur replied, his voice hardening slightly. I want a wife, on paper. In public, you will live in my home. You will wear my ring. You will smile for the cameras when we leave restaurants. In exchange, your debts are cleared. Your future is secured. Elena looked down at her lap. The muddy water from her skirt was pooling on the leather seat. She was shivering again, a deep, skeletal tremor. She was trapped. She could ask him to pull over, step out into the freezing rain, and go back to an apartment where she couldn't afford groceries, constantly looking over her shoulder for Trent. Or she could go with a man who killed people for a living, a man who looked at her not as a woman, but as a strategic chess piece. What if I say no? She asked, looking back up at him. Arthur held her gaze. I drop you off at the nearest police station. You file a report against Trent. I pay the officers to ignore it. And we never speak again. He was brutally honest. He didn't coat the threat in sugar. Elena closed her eyes. The ache in her jaw throbbed. Fine, she whispered into the quiet hum of the car. I'll be your alibi. Wife, Arthur corrected softly. If you act like an alibi, they'll arrest us both. Arthur's home wasn't a sprawling Gothic mansion. It was a brutalist fortress of glass, steel, and grey stone, perched on a cliff overlooking Lake Michigan. It looked cold. It felt even colder. When the heavy wooden front door clicked shut behind them, the silence of the house pressed against Elena's eardrums. There were no ticking clocks, no humming refrigerators. Just an immaculate, sterile quiet. Paul, Arthur said, not raising his voice. The large man from the alley, the one who had broken Trent's neck or jaw or whatever he had broken, stepped out from a hallway. In the light, he looked less like a thug and more like a tired accountant, wearing wire-rimmed glasses and a perfectly tailored suit. Boss, Paul murmured. Call Dr. Aris. Have him come to the guest wing. Then tell Maria to find something dry for her. Arthur gestured vaguely toward Eleanor. He didn't look at her. I'll be in my study. Without another word, Arthur walked away, his heavy coat sweeping behind him. Elena stood in the cavernous foyer, shivering violently, a puddle of dirty rainwater forming around her scuffed shoes. She felt intensely, painfully self-conscious. The floors were white marble. Her presence felt like a stain on the architecture. This way, miss, Paul said, his voice surprisingly gentle. 30 minutes later, Elena was sitting on the edge of a massive, king-sized bed in a guest room that was larger than her entire apartment. She was wearing a thick, oversized grey sweatshirt and loose sweatpants that the housekeeper, Maria, had hurriedly brought her. The fabric was heavy and smelled of lavender. It was the softest thing Elena had ever worn. She had scrubbed the grease and mud off in a walk-in shower that had 6 different shower heads. Looking in the fogged mirror, she had taken stock of the damage, a swollen, purple bruise blossoming on her left cheekbone, a split lip, angry red scrapes on her knees and palms, and her body. Heavy, soft, marked by stretch marks and dimples, a body that Trent had called disgusting, a body that Arthur Hayes had just claimed as his own. A sharp knock broke her thoughts. The door opened before she could answer. A small, older man with a medical bag entered. "Dr. Aris," he introduced himself, setting his bag on a glass table. "Mr. Hayes asked me to look you over." The exam was quick, professional, and entirely detached. Dr. Aris didn't ask how she got the bruises. He didn't ask why she was there. He checked her pupils with a penlight, palpated her ribs with cold fingers, and applied a stinging antiseptic to her scraped palms. "No concussion," the doctor concluded, packing his bag. "Keep ice on the cheek. I'll leave a tube of ointment for the abrasions. Take ibuprofen for the swelling." "Thank you," Elena muttered, pulling the oversized sweatshirt tighter around her thick waist. The doctor nodded and left. A minute later, the door opened again. Arthur walked in. He had taken off his overcoat and suit jacket. He wore a crisp white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, revealing forearms corded with muscle and faintly scarred skin. Without the coat, he looked less like a shadow and more like a man. A very dangerous, very exhausted man. He held a thick manila folder and a silver pen. He pulled up a modern leather chair and sat across from her. "Dr. Aris says you'll live," Arthur said, his eyes scanning her clean face, resting briefly on the swollen bruise on her cheek. "I've had worse from falling off my bike as a kid," Elena said defensively. Arthur opened the folder. "I need you to understand the parameters of this arrangement before you sign anything. Tomorrow, you will quit your job at the diner. Your lease on your apartment will be bought out. Your belongings will be packed and brought here. From tomorrow onward, you do not leave this property without a detail of my men." Elena's breath hitched. "A detail? Like guards?" "Like guards," Arthur confirmed, not looking up from the papers. "You are now publicly attached to the head of the Hayes Syndicate. To the FBI, you are a puzzle. To my rivals, you are a target. If you walk down the street alone to buy a coffee, you will be thrown into the back of a van, and they will mail me pieces of you to negotiate territory." The bluntness of the statement made the room spin slightly. Elena gripped the edge of the mattress. "Why did you pick me? Honestly, you could have paid some actress. Someone who looks right for the part." Arthur stopped reading. He closed the folder and looked at her. Really looked at her. His gaze dropped from her eyes to the heavy curve of her thighs under the sweatpants, to the way she hunched her shoulders to make herself look smaller. "An actress would panic when the bullets start flying," Arthur said softly. "An actress would sell me out the second an FBI agent offered her immunity. You survived Trent. You survive working double shifts for starvation wages. You have grit. I don't need someone who looks right. I need someone who won't break." He leaned forward, holding out the silver pen. "This is a marriage certificate," he said. "It has already been filed and backdated by a judge on my payroll. Signing this makes it legally binding. In exchange, $2 million will be placed in an offshore trust in your name, accessible to you the day this arrangement ends, whether that is in 1 year or 10. Elena stared at the pen. The silver caught the soft light of the bedroom lamps. $2 million. She wouldn't have to smell fryer grease ever again. She wouldn't have to freeze in her apartment. She wouldn't have to run from men like Trent. But she would be owned by a man like Arthur. "Will you?" Elena swallowed hard, her throat painfully dry. She forced herself to look him in the eye. "Will you expect me to sleep with you?" Arthur didn't flinch. His expression remained entirely neutral, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "I do not take things from women who are afraid of me. My bed is my own. Yours is this one. We share a last name, Elena." Nothing else. He knew her name. He hadn't asked, but he knew. Of course he did. Elena reached out. Her hand was trembling so badly she nearly dropped the heavy pen. She pressed the tip to the paper. The ink flowed smooth and black as she signed her name, tethering her messy, bruised life to the quiet monster sitting across from her. Arthur took the folder back. He stood up, smoothing the front of his shirt. "Get some sleep, Mrs. Hayes," he said quietly. "Tomorrow, we buy you a ring." Morning dragged itself over the grey expanse of Lake Michigan, bleeding weak, watery light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Eleanor's new bedroom. She woke up tangled in sheets that felt like spun silk, her heart hammering against her ribs. For 3 terrifying seconds, she didn't know where she was. She waited for the clank of the broken radiator. She waited for the smell of her neighbor's cheap marijuana filtering through the air vents. Instead, there was only the faint, crisp scent of eucalyptus and the heavy, suffocating silence of Arthur Hayes's estate. "Lift your arms, please." The woman's voice was clipped, carrying a slight French accent and a heavy dose of professional impatience. Her name was Madame Rousseau, and she smelled of harsh hairspray and peppermint mints. Elena stood in the center of Arthur's vast, slate-tiled living room, wearing only her cotton underwear and a silk slip Maria had provided. The cold air of the house pebbled her skin. 2 younger assistants buzzed around her like angry wasps, their mouths full of silver pins, their hands clutching yellow measuring tapes. Arthur sat on a dark leather sofa 30 feet away, reviewing a stack of printed financial documents. He wore a charcoal suit without the tie, his collar open, revealing the thick cords of his neck. He hadn't looked up since the tailors arrived, but Elena felt the weight of his presence in every shallow breath she took. A cold plastic measuring tape snapped around Elena's waist. The assistant pulled it taut, the edge digging sharply into the soft flesh of her stomach. Elena flinched, her cheeks burning hot and bright. 42, the assistant called out, her tone entirely neutral. But to Eleanor, it sounded like a megaphone broadcasting her failures. "Hips," Madame Rousseau commanded. The tape slid down, wrapping around her widest part. The assistant struggled slightly to get the tape level. Elena closed her eyes, wishing the slate floor would crack open and swallow her. She remembered Trent's voice in the alley. Piglet. Cow. She crossed her arms over her heavy chest, trying to make herself a smaller target in the vast, unforgiving room. "Drop your arms, madame," Rousseau sighed, tapping Elena's elbow with a gold pen. "We cannot measure the drape of the bodice if you hunch like a frightened animal." Elena's jaw locked. She tasted the lingering metallic tang of blood from her split lip, a sharp reminder of why she was standing here. She slowly lowered her arms, forcing her shoulders back. The skin of her thighs brushed together, sticky with nervous sweat despite the chill in the room. Arthur turned a page in his file. The crisp scrape of the paper sounded like a gunshot. "The shoulders are broad," Rousseau murmured to her assistant, circling Elena with a critical eye. "We must avoid capped sleeves. They will emphasize the bulk. Deep V-necks to elongate the torso. Darker palettes. We are dressing for structure, not whimsy. We need to corset the midsection. Bulk. Corset." The words were sterile, clinical, and devastating. Elena stared straight ahead at a bleak, modern painting on the wall, her throat tightening. She was a slab of clay being analyzed for its defects. "Leave her waist alone." The measuring tape dropped. Madame Rousseau turned, blinking in surprise. Arthur hadn't raised his head. He was still reading a spreadsheet, his silver pen tapping a rhythmic, slow beat against his knee. Do not put her in corsets. Do not attempt to compress her into a shape she isn't. You will build the garments around her, Rousseau. If she cannot breathe or sit comfortably, I will burn the dresses and find a tailor who understands basic human anatomy. A heavy, absolute stillness fell over the living room. The assistant stopped moving. Madame Rousseau cleared her throat, a nervous, high-pitched sound. Of course, Mr. Hayes. I only meant to flatter the silhouette. Her silhouette is fine, Arthur cut in, his voice deadening the room. He finally looked up. His grey eyes bypassed the tailor's entirely and landed on Eleanor. He didn't offer a reassuring smile. He just looked at her, his gaze steady and unflinching. Measure her accurately. Do it quickly, she's cold. He returned to his papers. Elena exhaled a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Her chest ached. The tailor's hands were noticeably gentler when they resumed, the tape measure no longer digging into her skin. 2 hours later, the tailors were gone, leaving behind racks of fabric swatches and a promise of a functional wardrobe by the following afternoon. Elena was back in her oversized grey sweatpants, sitting at the edge of a massive mahogany dining table. Maria had set a plate of grilled chicken and roasted vegetables in front of her. It smelled like rosemary and real butter, a far cry from the stale fries she usually survived on. Arthur walked into the dining room. He dropped a small, square velvet box onto the polished wood near her plate. It landed with a heavy, muffled thud. "Put it on," he instructed, pulling out a chair opposite her and sitting down. Elena wiped her hands on a linen napkin. She reached for the box. The hinges squeaked softly. She expected a blinding, obnoxious diamond, the kind of rock mobsters gave their wives in movies to prove their net worth. Instead, nestled in the black silk, was an antique piece, a heavy, brushed gold band holding a large, square-cut emerald. It was dark, the color of pine needles at midnight, flanked by 2 small, cloudy diamonds. "It was my grandmother's," Arthur said, pouring himself a glass of sparkling water. She brought it over from Dublin, stitched into the hem of her skirt. "It has history. The FBI knows its provenance. When they see it on your finger, they will know this isn't a temporary arrangement." Elena carefully lifted the ring. The gold was cold against her skin. It smelled faintly of brass polish and age. She slid it onto her left ring finger. It fit perfectly. The heavy weight of the gold anchored her hand to the table. It didn't feel like a piece of jewelry. It felt like a shackle. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice rough. "It's a prop," Arthur corrected flatly. "Tonight we take it to the stage." The dress was a deep, rich plum. It wasn't tight, but it was tailored so precisely that it brushed against her curves like a second skin, heavy silk that hid her stomach while framing her chest. Her dark hair had been pinned up by a stylist Arthur hired, exposing her neck and the fading yellowish edge of the bruise on her cheekbone. Walking into Laura, the most exclusive Italian restaurant in the Gold Coast district, Elena felt entirely fraudulent. The air inside smelled of shaved black truffles, roasted garlic, and old money. The lighting was low, casting everything in a warm, amber glow. The murmur of conversation was a low, cultivated hum, until Arthur Hayes walked in. Elena felt the shift in the room's atmospheric pressure immediately. The hum of conversation dipped. Forks paused over porcelain plates. Eyes darted toward the entrance, sliding off Arthur's immaculate black suit and landing squarely on Eleanor. She felt their gazes like physical touches, sharp, assessing, and confused. She tightened her grip on Arthur's arm. Her knuckles were white, her heels, expensive black leather pumps that pinched her wide feet, felt unsteady on the polished hardwood floor. "Breathe," Arthur murmured, his lips barely moving. His hand slid from his pocket and rested flat against the small of her back. The heat of his palm bled through the plum silk. It was a firm, grounding pressure. Look straight ahead. Do not look at their tables. The maitre d' practically bowed, sweating profusely as he led them to a secluded booth in the back corner. Elena slid into the plush leather booth, her hands immediately diving under the table to twist the heavy linen napkin into knots. Arthur sat across from her. He looked entirely at ease, but his eyes were scanning the room, mapping the exits, analyzing the patrons. Who are they? Elena whispered, leaning forward. Politicians, judges, rival associates, Arthur said, opening his menu. Everyone who has a vested interest in my demise. A waiter materialized, pouring a dark, rich Barolo wine into their crystal glasses before vanishing just as quickly. Elena reached for the glass, desperate for the alcohol to dull the sharp edges of her panic. Before her fingers touched the crystal, a shadow fell over their table. Arthur, I thought I smelled sulfur. The man standing over them wore a cheap, off-the-rack suit that bunched at the shoulders. He smelled heavily of stale coffee and peppermint gum, masking the sour scent of anxious sweat. He had a badge clipped to his belt. Arthur didn't look up from his menu. Agent Miller, I see the Bureau's per diem still doesn't cover decent dry cleaning. Miller smirked, leaning his palms flat on their table. His eyes slid to Elena. The scrutiny was invasive, crawling over her soft jawline, her heavy chest, and resting on the bruised cheek. And who is this? Miller asked, his voice dripping with condescension. She doesn't look like your usual type, Hayes. Did the Moretti girl finally figure out you're going to spend the rest of your life in Florence Supermax? Elena's stomach plummeted. This was the FBI. The people who could put Arthur away. The people who could unravel her lie. Arthur slowly closed his menu. He placed it on the table, aligning the edges perfectly with the silver flatware. Speak to my wife with that tone again, Miller, and I'll have my lawyers file a harassment injunction against the Bureau before your morning commute. Miller's smirk vanished. He blinked, clearly thrown off balance. Wife. Wife? Miller let out a short, barking laugh. You expect me to buy that? You, married to... He gestured vaguely at Elena, his eyes raking over her body with open disdain. You're slipping, Arthur. This is pathetic, even for you. The insult wasn't directed at Arthur. It was a direct hit on her. Elena felt the familiar, hot sting of tears threatening the corners of her eyes. She wanted to shrink. She wanted to apologize for existing in this space. It was the diner all over again. But then she felt the cold, heavy drag of the emerald ring against her finger under the table. She wasn't in the alley anymore. She wasn't a waitress begging for tips. She was Arthur Hayes's alibi, and she had survived worse men than this cheap, coffee-stained agent. Eleanor let go of the napkin. She brought her hands above the table, folding them neatly by her plate. The emerald caught the candlelight, flashing a vicious, deep green. She looked Miller dead in the eye. I'm sorry, Elena said, her voice dropping into the flat, exhausted cadence of a Chicago lifer who had dealt with thousands of rude customers. Did you need something? Because my husband and I are trying to order, and you're blocking the waiter. If you want an autograph, you can call his assistant. Miller's mouth opened slightly. The complete lack of fear, the sheer annoyance in her tone, derailed his interrogation tactic. He expected a frightened civilian. He got a woman who had worked double shifts in the city's worst neighborhoods. Arthur didn't smile, but Elena saw the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in his posture. The tension in his jaw relaxed. This is a joke, Miller sneered, though the confidence had bled out of his voice. He pointed a finger at Arthur. We are watching you, Hayes. This little charade won't stop the indictments." "Enjoy your evening, Agent Miller," Arthur said softly. Miller scowled, cast one last venomous look at Eleanor, and turned away, marching back toward the bar. Elena let out a long, shaky exhale, her shoulders dropping. Her hands began to tremble violently, now that the confrontation was over. She reached for her water glass, but her grip was too loose. The glass slipped, clinking sharply against the table, spilling a small puddle of ice water onto the white tablecloth. "Damn it!" she hissed, grabbing her napkin to sop it up, the humiliation returning in a rush. Arthur's hand shot out. His long, calloused fingers closed over her wrist, stopping her frantic wiping. His grip was strong, unyielding, but not painful. "Leave it," Arthur said. Elena looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears of adrenaline and embarrassment. "You didn't break," Arthur said, his thumb brushing lightly against the pulse point on her wrist. It was an analytical touch, measuring her rapid heart rate. He pressed, and you bit back. "You did perfectly, Elena." Hearing her name in his low, gravelly voice sent a strange shiver down her spine. It wasn't romance. It was validation from a predator who recognized teeth in someone else. "He looked at me like I was garbage," she whispered, pulling her hand gently from his grip. "He looked at you like you were an obstacle," Arthur corrected, picking up his wine glass. "And he is right to think so. Drink your wine. Tomorrow, the rumor of Arthur Hayes's new wife will be on every wiretap in the city." The estate was a tomb at 3 now a.m. Elena gave up on sleep. The mattress was too soft, swallowing her heavy frame like quicksand. The silence of the house was deafening. She was used to the rumble of the L train rattling her window panes, the shouting matches from the alley behind her old apartment, the sirens. Here, the quiet felt suffocating, pressing against her ears until they rang. She pushed the heavy duvet off and swung her legs over the edge of the bed. She was wearing the oversized grey sweatshirt again. She felt ridiculous sleeping in the expensive silk nightgowns Maria had hung in the closet. Barefoot, Elena padded out into the hallway. The marble floor was freezing against her soles. The house was dimly lit by recessed floor lights that guided her toward the massive, open-concept kitchen. She just wanted a glass of tap water. Something normal. As she rounded the corner into the living room, the sharp scent of aged whiskey and burnt tobacco hit her. Arthur was sitting in a deep leather armchair by the unlit fireplace. He was stripped down to a black undershirt and dark trousers. A half-empty bottle of amber liquid sat on the low glass table next to him. He was cleaning a handgun. Eleanor froze, her breath catching in her throat. The dull metallic snick-clack of the slide moving backward echoed in the quiet room. He had a small cloth draped over his knee, a tin of solvent open on the table. He didn't look like a businessman right now. He looked exactly like the monster the FBI claimed he was. "You walk too heavily for someone trying to sneak up on a man with a gun," Arthur said into the darkness. He didn't look up, expertly sliding a spring into place. "I wasn't trying to sneak up on you," Elena said, her voice raspy with sleep. She wrapped her arms around her waist, suddenly hyper-aware of her bare legs and messy hair. "I just wanted water." Arthur set the reassembled slide onto the table. He picked up a clean rag and wiped the solvent from his hands. "Kitchen is to your left. Tap is filtered." Eleanor hesitated, then forced her feet to move. She walked into the kitchen, keeping her back to him as she filled a heavy crystal tumbler from the sink. She drank it too fast, the cold water aching against her teeth. When she turned back, Arthur was watching her. In the dim light, the exhaustion carved deep canyons into his face. He didn't look terrifying anymore. He looked incredibly, impossibly tired. She shouldn't engage. She should go back to her gilded cage and lock the door. But the deep loneliness of the house pushed her forward. She walked back into the living room and sat on the edge of the sofa opposite his chair, leaving 10 feet of empty space between them. "Do you ever sleep?" she asked, pulling her knees up to her chest, trying to make herself smaller. Arthur poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass. He didn't offer her any. "Sleep is a vulnerability. I take it in shifts. You're in your own home," she pointed out, shivering slightly as the chill of the room seeped through her sweatpants. "You have guards outside. Paul is down the hall. Who are you afraid of?" Arthur took a slow sip of his drink. He leaned his head back against the leather chair, staring at the high, shadowed ceiling. "The men outside are paid. Loyalty purchased with cash expires the moment someone else offers more. Paul is loyal, but he is one man. The FBI has the power of the federal government, and the Moretti family has 300 armed soldiers who want my port contracts. Fear is the wrong word, Elena. It is hyper-vigilance. The moment I relax, I am dead." It was a bleak, miserable existence. He had millions of dollars, a house that belonged in an architectural digest, and he couldn't close his eyes. "Why do it then?" she asked quietly. "If it's this miserable, you could leave. You have the money." Arthur lowered his head, looking at her. A bitter, hollow smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You cannot resign from a syndicate. You only retire to a pine box. I inherited this war from my father. I will end it. Or it will end me." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. The smell of gun oil and alcohol bridged the gap between them. "What about you, Elena? Why didn't you leave?" "Leave where?" "The diner." "The city," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into something resembling curiosity. "Trent has been extorting you for 8 months. You are intelligent. You are resilient. Why stay and let a street rat bleed you dry?" Elena looked down at her hands. The scrapes from the alley were healing, angry red scabs marring her thick knuckles. "Because poverty is a cage," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's not a choice. You can't just pack a bag and leave when you don't have enough money for a bus ticket, let alone a first month's rent in a new city. Trent knew I was trapped. He knew nobody would care what happened to the fat girl pouring coffee." The words hung in the air, raw and ugly. She hated admitting it out loud. Arthur didn't offer her empty platitudes. He didn't tell her she was beautiful or that society was wrong. He didn't lie to her. "The world is built to punish weakness," Arthur said, his voice flat, factual. He stood up. He walked over to the sofa, his footsteps completely silent. He stopped right in front of her. Elena's heart hammered, but she didn't shrink back. She tipped her head up to look at him. Arthur reached out. His knuckles brushed against her cheek, feather light, barely touching the fading yellow edge of her bruise. His hands were warm, smelling faintly of the chemical solvent. "You are not weak, Elena," he said softly, the gravel in his voice softening into something dangerous and intimate. "You just didn't have teeth. Now you share mine." He dropped his hand, stepping back into the shadows. "Go to sleep, Mrs. Hayes. You have an interview with the Chicago Tribune tomorrow afternoon. We need to sell a love story." He turned and walked down the long, dark hallway, leaving Eleanor alone in the cold room, her cheek burning where he had touched her. She pulled her knees tighter to her chest, terrifyingly aware that the safest she had felt in 10 years was in the house of a murderer. Camera flashes bled purple spots into Elena's vision. She blinked rapidly, her eyes watering against the harsh, synthetic bursts of light filling Arthur's normally cavernous, shadowed study. The Chicago Tribune had sent Sarah Jenkins. Jenkins was a woman carved from ambition and kale salads, wearing a cream pantsuit that probably cost 3 months of Elena's old rent. She smelled of expensive dry shampoo and predatory journalism. Elena sat rigid on the edge of a leather Chesterfield sofa, her knees pressed tightly together. The plum silk dress from the restaurant had been swapped for a tailored navy sheath. It was conservative, heavy, and armor-like. Arthur sat beside her, his thigh inches from hers, projecting an aura of relaxed, impenetrable calm. "It's just a very abrupt courtship, Mr. Hayes," Jenkins said, her pen tapping a rhythmic, irritating beat against her digital recorder. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. It was a surgical tool, probing for a soft spot. "You are notorious for your privacy. You date debutantes and heiresses, and then, overnight, you marry a woman with no public profile. Some might call it a strategic maneuver." Arthur didn't blink. "Some people have too much time to speculate on the private lives of others, Ms. Jenkins. But surely you understand the public's curiosity?" Jenkins pressed, shifting her gaze to Eleanor. The reporter's eyes flicked down, taking in the broad line of Eleanor's shoulders, the thickness of her waist, the fading shadow of the bruise on her cheek. The assessment was entirely silent and entirely devastating. "Elena, you must feel like Cinderella, plucked from a South Side diner and dropped into a lakefront estate. How did he sweep you off your feet?" Acid climbed Elena's throat. Cinderella. The word was a trap. If she gushed about romance, Jenkins would smell the lie. If she froze, the FBI would have their proof of a sham. Elena looked down at her hands. The emerald ring felt like a lead weight. She thought of the alley. She thought of Trent's boot in her back, the smell of rotting lettuce, the cold rainwater. She thought of Arthur crushing his cigarette out, offering a gloved hand instead of pity. "He didn't sweep me off my feet," Elena said. Her voice was surprisingly steady. Jenkins stopped tapping her pen. Arthur shifted slightly, turning his head to look at her. Eleanor met the reporter's sharp gaze. "I was drowning, Ms. Jenkins. I worked 70 hours a week just to keep my heat on. Men looked at me and either saw a joke or an easy target to abuse. Arthur didn't come into the diner and order a coffee and ask for my number. He found me on the worst night of my life, in an alley, being assaulted by a man I owed money to." The room went dead silent. Even the photographer lowered his camera. "I was on the ground," Elena continued, the memory pulling the raw, ugly truth from her lungs. "And Arthur stepped in. He didn't ask what I had done to deserve it. He just stopped it. He looked at me, and he didn't see a joke. He saw a person. I didn't marry him for the house. I married him because he's the only man who ever made me feel safe." Jenkins stared, her mouth slightly parted. She had expected a PR script. She hadn't expected the gritty, unpolished reality of poverty and violence. Arthur's hand moved. He didn't pat her knee or offer a rehearsed, loving squeeze. He laced his fingers through hers, his grip tight, calloused, and fiercely possessive. "My wife is a private woman," Arthur said, his voice a low, vibrating hum that commanded the room. "She has endured things the people who read your paper couldn't survive for 10 minutes. I did not marry an heiress, Miss Jenkins, because I do not need a woman who breaks when the wind blows. I need a partner who understands the reality of the world we live in." He leaned forward, locking eyes with the reporter. "Write your article. Call it a fairy tale if you want to sell copies. But understand this. Elena is mine. Anyone who questions her place beside me or disrespects her presence will find out exactly why I am not a man to be speculated about." The interview ended 5 minutes later. When the heavy front door clicked shut behind the journalists, Elena exhaled a long, shuddering breath, pulling her hand from Arthur's. Her palm was sweating. "I talked too much," she whispered, rubbing her forehead. "I gave them too much." You gave them exactly what we needed, Arthur said. He poured a glass of water from a crystal pitcher and handed it to her. You gave them a truth they couldn't dismantle. The FBI relies on logic. They expect a financial transaction. They don't expect trauma bonding. It was brilliant. He looked at her, and for the first time, the dead, tarnished dimes of his eyes held a flicker of genuine respect. It felt heavier than the emerald ring. 2 weeks passed. The Tribune article ran on the front page of the Sunday edition. Agent Miller's tale on the Maybach vanished. The house settled into a bizarre, quiet domesticity. Elena learned Arthur took his coffee black, slept only between the hours of 4 and 7 in the morning, and never walked past a window without checking the reflection. She learned the names of his guards: Paul, the stoic giant; Davis, the young driver; and Collins, a man with nervous eyes who always seemed to be sweating. It happened on a Tuesday night. The temperature outside had plummeted to single digits, freezing the lake into jagged, ugly slabs of grey ice. Elena was in the kitchen, boiling water for tea. She was wearing her oversized grey sweatpants and a faded college t-shirt. The house was dead quiet. Then a dull, heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards. It wasn't a dropped book. It was the sound of a human body hitting the marble in the front hall. Elena froze, the tea tin halfway to the counter. The silence that followed was entirely wrong. It was thick, electric. "Paul!" she called out, her voice barely a whisper. A sharp, metallic pop shattered the quiet, followed instantly by the sound of breaking glass in the study. A silenced gunshot. Adrenaline dumped into Elena's bloodstream like ice water. The teacup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the tile. She didn't scream. Her life had taught her that screaming only agitated the men hitting you. She dropped to her hands and knees, ignoring the ceramic shards biting into her palms, and scrambled behind the massive kitchen island. Heavy, tactical boots crunched over the marble in the hallway. Not one person. 3. "Clear the ground floor. Find the bitch. Hayes is in the study," a voice hissed. It was Collins, the nervous guard, the rat. Elena clamped her hands over her mouth, her breath tearing through her lungs in ragged gasps. He had sold them out to the Morettis. Gunfire erupted from the east wing, deafening, unsilenced, tearing through drywall and shattering the expensive quiet of the estate. Arthur. He was fighting back. Footsteps entered the kitchen. They were slow, deliberate. "Come out, Cinderella," Collins called out softly, his voice trembling with manic energy. "Moretti says he wants to see if you bleed gravy." "Make it easy." Elena's eyes darted frantically around her hiding spot. She had no weapon, just broken porcelain and a cast-iron skillet sitting on the lower shelf of the island. She reached out, her thick fingers wrapping around the heavy iron handle. It weighed at least 8 pounds. Collins's boots rounded the corner of the island. He was holding a suppressed pistol, his eyes sweeping the far side of the room. He didn't look down immediately. He expected her to be cowering in a corner, crying. He expected a victim. Elena didn't think. She didn't plan. She channeled 10 years of rage, 10 years of being pushed around, ridiculed, and underestimated. She lunged upward from the floor, driving her entire body weight forward. Collins gasped, startled by the sudden movement at his knees. Before he could aim the gun, Elena swung the cast-iron skillet with both hands, putting every ounce of her heavy, broad shoulders behind it. The iron connected with his kneecap with a sickening, wet crunch. Collins shrieked, a high-pitched sound of pure agony. His leg buckled instantly, the gun firing wildly into the ceiling as he collapsed. He hit the floor hard. Elena didn't stop. She knew from the alley that if a man could still breathe, he could still hurt her. She threw her entire weight onto him, her knees slamming into his chest, pinning his gun arm to the tile. He thrashed wildly, a panicked animal, his free hand clawing at her face, tearing a patch of skin from her cheek. He was strong, but he was compromised, and Eleanor was immovable. Her bulk, the very thing she had been taught to hate, the thing society told her made her worthless, became her absolute anchor. She crushed the breath out of his lungs. She raised the skillet again. She didn't want to do it. God, she didn't want to, but she brought it down on the side of his head. Collins went limp, his eyes rolling back. Elena scrambled off him, her chest heaving, her hand slick with sweat and the blood from her cheek. She grabbed his dropped pistol, her finger trembling near the trigger guard, though she had no idea how to turn the safety off. Suddenly, a shadow filled the kitchen doorway. Elena whipped around, raising the heavy gun with both hands, a sob finally tearing from her throat. "Drop it!" Arthur stood in the doorway. His white dress shirt was torn at the shoulder, a spreading stain of crimson soaking the fabric. He held a high-capacity tactical pistol in his right hand. Smoke drifted lazily from the barrel. He looked at Elena, shaking violently, covered in someone else's blood, standing over the unconscious body of the man who had sold him out. Slowly, carefully, Elena lowered the gun. It slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the tile. Her knees finally gave out. She slumped against the oak cabinets, burying her face in her hands. Arthur walked over. He kicked Collins's weapon across the floor. He didn't check the traitor's pulse. He knelt in front of Eleanor, ignoring the blood dripping down his own arm. He reached out, his bloody, calloused hands gently pulling her wrists away from her face. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice rougher than sandpaper. Elena opened her eyes. They were wild, terrified. "I hit him. I think I killed him." "He's breathing," Arthur said, his thumbs swiping the tears and blood from her cheeks. "Paul got the other two. It's over. The rat is caught." He didn't pull her into a romantic embrace. He didn't treat her like a fragile piece of glass. He looked at the dented cast-iron skillet, and then he looked back at her. "You fought back," Arthur murmured, an undercurrent of dark, profound awe in his voice. "You saved my flank, Elena." "I was just trying not to die," she choked out. "You lived," Arthur corrected fiercely. He gripped her chin, forcing her to look at him, at the predator who had finally found a mate in the dark. "You are never going back to a diner, Elena. You belong to this house now. You belong to me." Dawn broke cold and grey, illuminating the destruction of the estate. Plaster dust coated the mahogany furniture in the study. The front doors were splintered. A private medical team had come and gone, taking Collins and the bodies of the hit men away in unmarked vans, leaving the marble floors bleached and sterile once more. Agent Miller arrived at 7:30 a.m., flanked by 3 tactical officers, banging on the temporary barricade Paul had erected. Arthur sat in his leather armchair in the living room, his shoulder expertly stitched and bandaged beneath a fresh black sweater. Eleanor sat on the sofa opposite him, a butterfly bandage securing the deep scratch on her cheek. Paul let Miller in. The FBI agent marched into the living room, his face flushed with triumph. He expected to find a crime scene. He expected a reason to arrest Arthur Hayes. "We had reports of automatic gunfire, Hayes," Miller barked, his hand resting aggressively on his holstered weapon. "We know the Morettis made a move. Where are the bodies? You can't bleach away a federal mandate." Arthur calmly picked up his coffee cup. He took a sip, wincing slightly as his shoulder muscle pulled. "I have no idea what you're talking about, Agent Miller. A transformer blew down the street. It startled my wife." Miller sneered. "Don't play games. We know Collins flipped. Where is he?" "Mr. Collins abruptly resigned last night," Arthur said flatly. "He mentioned moving to Florida. I suggest you check the airports." Miller looked around the immaculate room, his frustration boiling over. His eyes landed on Eleanor. She looked exhausted, her hair messy, a bandage on her face. "You don't have to cover for him," Miller said to her, his voice taking on a sickening, faux gentle tone. "I know he uses people. I know he forces people to do things. Tell me what happened here last night, Elena. I can put you in witness protection. You can get away from this animal. You can go back to a normal life." Elena stared at the FBI agent. She thought about her normal life, the freezing apartment, the threat of Trent waiting in the alley, the invisible, crushing weight of being poor and unprotected. She looked at Arthur. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at Miller, his face a mask of absolute, terrifying violence, barely kept in check. He wasn't forcing her to stay. The door was open. Elena set her coffee mug on the table. The heavy emerald ring clicked against the ceramic. "Agent Miller," Elena said, her voice dropping into the same flat, cold cadence Arthur used. It wasn't an imitation. It was an absorption. "My husband had a difficult night sleeping. I dropped a heavy pan in the kitchen, and a window broke from the wind. If you don't have a warrant to inspect my kitchenware, I would like you to leave my home." Miller's jaw tightened. The faux concern vanished, replaced by pure, acidic hatred. He realized in that moment that the narrative wasn't a lie anymore. The diner waitress was gone. The woman sitting on the sofa was Mrs. Hayes. "You're making a mistake," Miller spat. "When the indictments come down, I'm taking you with him." "Then you better bring an army," Elena replied softly. Miller turned on his heel and stormed out, his officers trailing behind him like whipped dogs. The heavy barricade slammed shut. Silence returned to the estate. It didn't feel suffocating anymore. It felt secure. Arthur set his coffee down. He stood up, walking slowly across the space between them until he was standing over her. He reached down, his uninjured hand offering her his palm. Elena looked up at him. She placed her hand in his. He pulled her up, his grip strong, hauling her into his chest. He smelled of medical alcohol, rich coffee, and the sharp tang of survival. He didn't kiss her. That wasn't who they were. He rested his chin on the top of her head, his good arm wrapping heavily around her waist, pulling her solid, warm frame against his. "You lied to a federal agent," Arthur murmured into her hair. "I learned from the best," Elena whispered against his sweater. They stood in the ruins of the living room, two broken, hardened people who had found the exact right pieces to fit their jagged edges. It wasn't a fairy tale. Cinderella didn't bash skulls with cast-iron skillets. But as Elena stood in the arms of a mafia boss, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his heart against her cheek, she realized she had finally found something better than a knight. She had found a partner in the dark. If you loved this gritty, raw, mafia romance, smash that like button to let us know. Share this story with your friends who love fiercely protective, morally grey heroes and strong, unapologetic female leads who fight back. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment between Elena and Arthur? We want to hear your thoughts. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next dark romance.